Unfortunately, you are not listening in on an animated discussion this week. Caleb and I had a bit of a scheduling snarl and we couldn't get together to record the last 3 episodes about Batman the Animated Series. That's right, the last 3 episodes! We're very excited to bring that series to a close and regret that we couldn't keep the momentum going. But rest assured, very shortly, we'll be closing the books on Batman the Animated Series and heading into the next era of the DC animated universe. And to show how intertwined the new Batman Adventures and Superman the Animated Series are, we'll be kicking that off with their 3-part crossover, World's Finest. But that's still a few weeks away. And to make sure you get your Batman fix this week, here's the first installment of my podcast, Superhero University About Batman, a brief history of the Bat. If you enjoy it, you'll find links to the rest of the episodes about Batman and Son in the show notes. We'll see you back here next time. Same bat time, same bat channel. Hello, I'm Joshua Unruh, your superhero scholar. Welcome to Superhero University on the history of Batman. Living under the shadow of the bat. Have a seat. Class is now in session. Hey class, welcome back after a small hiatus on Superhero University, but I'm very excited to be back here talking to you about one of my favorite characters, the Batman, as a lead-in to one of my favorite Batman stories. In my opinion, one of the, if not the greatest Batman stories of all time, which is actually several stories put together into one years-long story. So if you're wanting to read ahead, what you're looking for is Batman and Son. That's where we're going to go from here. But one of the very important and most interesting things to me about Morrison's approach to writing Batman, and it's an approach that almost no one else had taken, certainly not in decades, is that every single Batman story happened. All of them. All 70 plus years of them happened in this particular Bruce Wayne's own personal continuity in history. So because of that, I thought that you all might be interested in a larger history of Batman. This is not usually the thing that I do in Superhero University. Usually we jump right into the book, but because these real world ebbs and flows in Batman's publishing history impact this story, and because I find the real-world publishing history of Batman so fascinating, I wanted to start there for this series. So first things first, we're going to take a run through Batman through the decades, okay? I'm going to keep this real high line. You will almost certainly have questions. You are welcome to come to me on Twitter. If you are a patron, we will be having a live session where we discuss these things that I will then edit and release as an episode of Superhero University later. But for the moment, we're going to keep this very high level, and we're just going to hit the most important parts of each decade to Batman. Even though he debuted in 1939, the very end of the 1930s, we nevertheless have to talk about the Batman. That's BAT-MAN, which is how he was originally billed. Weird creature of the night, the Bat-Man. So he debuts in 1939, very shortly after Superman created the genre of the superhero. Now, ostensibly, Bob Kane created Batman. That's what you're going to hear. You're going to see created by Bob Kane still to this day on the first page of every Batman comic book. You're going to see it at the beginning of movies where Batman appears. It is also patently untrue, or at the very least, it is very misleading. So everything that you think of as being uniquely Batman was almost assuredly created by Bill Finger and later embellished upon by Dick Sprang. Originally, Batman was conceived as a very thinly veiled Shadow ripoff, up to and including a Shadow plot being changed extremely minimally so that it could star Batman instead of the Shadow. Now, very briefly, for those of you who are not aware, the Shadow is a radio star mystery man. He actually started out as a announcer for a sort of anthology mystery series, but the Shadow, voiced by Orson Welles, was so compelling that soon he found himself the star of his own radio show, wherein he was a mystery man, able to cloud men's minds. He investigated crimes. He was a dark avenger of the night. He wore a disguise, not a costume, but a disguise, so that he could operate in his war on crime. Some famous lines you might recognize from the Shadow. Who knows what evil lurks in the minds of men? The Shadow knows. Yeah, look, I know Orson Welles did it better, but that's how it was, okay? Another one is the weed of crime bears bitter fruit. These are things that the Shadow said while he fought crime on the radio. So it really makes a lot of sense that somebody would show up at the offices of what would become DC Comics and say to them, we got this Superman guy, right? He fights crime by day. He is a brand new thing, this superhero. Why don't we take one of these nighttime Avengers, these mystery men types, wrap them up in superhero drag and make that story? And of course, they thought that was a great idea. The problem was that Bob Kane didn't put any more thought into it than that. He just did Shadow stories starring a guy in a better costume. Now, this is the point that I should mention. If you go check the show notes, you will find a link to several slides that I have put together to kind of help you with the visuals of this thing. Within those slides is a comic strip by Ty Templeton, where he talks about how everything you think of as uniquely Batman was not created by Bob Kane. He does this by poking fun at Bob Kane's original concept, which was he would be a guy in red tights, no cowl. He just had a scalloped cape. That's really the only thing that Bob Kane brought to it. No Batmobile, no Commissioner Gordon, no Batcave. All that stuff belongs to other people. Only the most bare bones basic idea of Batman, which is basically, let's take a mystery man and turn him into a superhero and play with weird creature of the night stuff, except how does that work in red tights, right? All that is Bob Kane. The stuff that shows up that makes you think uniquely Batman is a whole bunch of people, but at the beginning, predominantly Bill Finger and Dick Sprang. However, even though Batman is extremely derivative from the Shadow, he very quickly set himself apart from the radio and pulp mystery men and cemented himself firmly in the superhero pantheon and tradition. So going into the 1940s, which again is only a year or two after Batman's publication, we move into 1940, and almost immediately we have to discuss the sensational character find of 1940, Robin the Boy Wonder. Robin is the first of the kid's sidekicks, and he really defined that piece of the superhero genre. He also began the Batman's transformation from a grim, vengeful loner into a team player and eventually a father figure, very quickly into a father figure. Now, there'll be a lot more to say about this as the seminar goes on, but right now, just know that this is when it happened. Almost as early as anything in Batman's history happened, we had a Robin. Now, throughout the rest of the 1940s, this is the time when superheroes kind of cemented themselves in the public consciousness. A combination of the post-Superman superhero boom and then the patriotic fervor of World War II meant that every kid in America had a superhero punching Nazis and telling them to do paper drives and buy war bonds. You had star-spangled heroes like Wonder Woman and Captain America, and if you've listened to me on my Marvel Cinematic Universe podcast, you have heard me discuss how Captain America alone outsold Time magazine. So this is the moment when superheroes become big, and it starts with Superman, then you have Batman. Very quickly, you have these star-spangled heroes like Wonder Woman and Captain America making their debuts alongside these bigger names like Superman and Batman. And because it was a time of questionable decisions by America and Americans about how we were going to discuss our Japanese and German immigrant citizens, you also started to get a lot of questionable suggestions on the covers and in these war bonds advertisements made by these otherwise paragons of virtue. They would suggest that you do racially insensitive things and that you think and talk about America's enemies in a certain way. I am not going to go deep into that in audio. I have included it in the slides, and you are welcome to go take a look at them, but they're not things that I feel comfortable saying out loud in a recorded format where anyone could hear me say them devoid of context. They're that bad. It's a rough time. It's a bad look, and it's a look that will get worse as the years go on. Now, moving from the 1940s into the 1950s, this is when things kind of get weird. And I mean that both in the real world and the way that that affects superheroes. First of all, we have John McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee. There could be entire podcasts, and there are probably entire history podcasts that talk about McCarthyism and the HUAC and all the ways that that terrorized the American populace. I am going to drill down specifically in how it affected superheroes and specifically Batman, but I recommend taking a look at that dark time in our nation's history because it looks in many ways uncomfortably similar to 2018. So be aware, there's a larger context here, and I am looking at the most specific part of it. So McCarthyism and the House Un-American Activities Committee et al. Kind of developed a weird fascination with a book by David Wortham called Seduction of the Innocent. David Wortham is a psychologist, and his book, Seduction of the Innocent, drew a direct line between the reading of comic books and juvenile delinquency. Now, this book actually gets a worse rap than it deserves. It's still pretty damning, though, because literally every kid in America read comic books. Every one of them. This is before TV. This is before radio is really big, and it's certainly not doing a lot of kid-specific programming. And you're talking about things that cost 5 cents. Comic books are the entertainment, the throwaway, disposable entertainment that everyone expected kids to read. And at the time, there was a lot more opportunity to read different genres. It wasn't all superheroes. In fact, again, till 1939, it wasn't any superheroes. And there was a boom after that, but that didn't stop the publication of romance comics and Western comics and horror comics. Every genre that could possibly be imagined was represented in comic books in the 40s and moving into the 50s. And David Wortham said that every kid that he looked at who turned out to be a juvenile delinquent or have, air quotes, deviant predilections, all of those kids read comic books. To which anyone who paid attention would say, of course they did, because all the kids that don't become juvenile delinquents also read comics. But I will admit, he also made some very excellent points and is kind of at the forefront of discussing the importance of formative education and standards in fiction for kids. Not necessarily censoring, but realizing that these are not fully formed adults who should be reading anything and everything at any moment unfettered. Now, there is a whole other conversation about how much the government should be looking out for that and how much parents should. And that's a discussion that frankly has shifted massively between the 1950s and today. It's a whole much deeper conversation that is not what I'm going into here. But I will include in the show notes a link to a couple of fantastic episodes about Wortham by a podcast I enjoy a lot called Drawing a Dialogue. So look for those in the show notes if you want to know more about Wortham and get something of a more balanced critique. Again, I'm not trying to damn the guy as much as telling you that superhero fandom and sort of the narrative that grows up around superhero comics do not have time for Wortham. He kind of ruins comic books as far as superhero fans going forward are concerned. It's not a wrong take, but it's not a complete take either. Now, the way that happens is Wortham testifies in front of Congress. He writes Seduction of the Innocent. It happens to catch a lot of, I guess I would say, educational pop cultural attention. Parents were reading it and starting to worry about what their kids were reading. And suddenly you have comic book companies stepping in to police themselves so that the government doesn't do it. Now that sounds like a good idea, and I guess it is in theory, but what it really winds up looking like is the superhero publishers are able to push out the crime and horror publishers. And along the way, the bigger superhero publishers are able to push out much smaller competitors. Again, you are getting the high lines of this, and I'm not going to drill down into all the legal wrangling that happened, but it's definitely an opportunity for, say, the company that is DC by this point to put a bunch of horror companies like EC Comics out of business. So, policed by themselves, you now have no more horror, No more violent images. The criminals must always be punished in the end. And as you can imagine, this is very complicated and in many ways antithetical to Batman's ethos. He works at night. He has shot vampires with silver bullets. Sometimes the criminals get away, that kind of thing. He is, if nothing else, as a non-superpowered person, so his stories cannot center on big feats of strength or something like that. He punches people. He and Robin punch the bad guys. Like, that might be potentially too violent under these new strictures called the Comic Code. However, the 50s were also the golden age of science fiction. And so rather than fighting mundane criminals or even supernatural monsters, Batman just shifts suddenly and kind of unexpectedly in a way into having fanciful adventures in outer space. He gets his own fifth dimensional imp, not unlike Superman's Mr. Mxyzptlk. So taking a look at the slides, you can see we've got Batman becoming the Superman of Planet X. We've got him meeting a Batman from another planet, the Batman of Zur-En-Arrh. We have the very famous Robin Dies at Dawn, a sensational two-part adventure, which, by the way, meant that it would take up 2 of the slots on this comic book that usually had 5 or 6 stories. Off to the side, you see Batman meets Batmite. This all happens in the science fiction-charged 1950s. Batman's family expands prodigiously. Moving to the next slide, you can see what I mean by the family. You have family photos. It literally says, "Greetings from the Batman family." You also have not just Robin and Batman and maybe Alfred, but we're including Batmite in the family. You've got Commissioner Gordon in sort of a grandfatherly type situation. And you also have Batwoman and Batgirl. Now, these are not the versions of those characters that you are most familiar with, and that's fine. We'll talk about them as this thing progresses. But just know, this is when that explosion of Bat-related characters happens. It happens both on the side of good, the Batman family, because you also see the International Club of Heroes. So these are all Batmen from around the world, basically. People who are inspired by Batman to fight crime in their native country. Or, in the case of Man of Bats, within the Native American communities of the United States. And his rogues gallery grew in unexpected and very colorful and yet silly directions. Like Kite Man. That's a guy who robs places with kites. And you have Signal Man, who uses all manner of traffic signals and signs in his crimes. You also have Zebra Man, who is weird and has radioactive powers and is kind of nonsense. But that's the point. The 1950s is an explosion of nonsense within the Batman mythos because they have to move away from all the stuff that they have built themselves on for the last 10 or 15 years and move in a different direction because of McCarthyism, the HUAC, the Comics Code Authority, etc. And it really sets the stage for the 1960s. In the 1960s, it's Batmania. The Batman television show hits in 1966 and ran for 3 seasons, and it changed everything. It is impossible to underestimate how much influence this show had on the pop culture. We are still making reference to it today after decades of it being ignored for being really dumb. That's a thing you may not realize. When I was young, I watched Batman 66 in reruns after school. It was just another version of Batman for me. By the time I was in middle school, it was considered really stupid and embarrassing and not a thing that DC Comics ever wanted to reference again. It is only recently, like in the last handful of years, that this TV series has started to receive the respect that it was always due. We've got a Blu-ray release. We have a new Batman 66 comic done in the style of the show. We just have a reappreciation for this version of Batman. But in 1966 and for 3 years after that, that was it. That was the only Batman we had, and everybody loved it. This is an important thing for those of you who aren't steeped in the comic book stuff, or specifically in Batman. Don't let anybody tell you the lie that that show is what made comics sillier. That show was taken straight from the comics. There's a lot more detail and a lot more fun stories about how that show was developed that we could go into, and I may talk about them later. But right now, just know that the first few episodes of that show were basically adapted directly from already on the stands comic book stories. And the visual style of that show was based on the art style in the comic books, mostly drawn at the time by a genius called Carmine Infantino. This show did not make comics sillier. It did what the comics were doing at the time. From there, we move into the 1970s, and as you can imagine, when something becomes as popular as Batman did in the 60s, and then it drops off precipitously by the third season, what you get is backlash. The 1970s were all about backlash against the show Batman 66. Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams, huge looming names in the history of Batman, show up and redefine Batman as both a loner vigilante and also start to introduce some globetrotting James Bond-style adventures. They revitalized old villains like the Joker, who, if you can believe it, had kind of fallen on hard times because of Batman 66. Cesar Romero's take on the Joker was not the most popular villain on that show, partly because Cesar Romero was working a lot and couldn't be there as often as the show writers wanted to feature the Joker. So Denny O'Neil revitalized old villains like the Joker. They create new villains like Maxie Zeus, a crazy millionaire who viewed himself as the literal incarnation of Zeus and built like flying sky fortresses and electricity throwing machines for his lightning bolt. Now, most famously, Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams created Ra's al Ghul and his inimitable daughter, Talia. For those of you who are most familiar with Ra's from the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, I'm really sorry, because those movies did not do him any favors. He is an immortal eco-terrorist who feels like the world peaked as far as population goes, and the only way to fix it is to kill 80% of the world and for him to rule the 20% that's left. And in the process of this, he discovers the Batman and thinks that the Batman is his only worthy heir. He tries to marry Batman off to his daughter and make him a part of his vast global criminal enterprise. And of course, Batman isn't into it, but he loves Talia. And so there's this fantastic soap opera thing going on at the same time that you have a bare-chested Batman still wearing his cowl, sword fighting an immortal eco-terrorist on top of a blimp. It was a pretty good time. And as much as O'Neil and Adams get credit for bringing back a more dark and serious Batman, you can tell by the way I talk about some of these stories, they might be taking them more seriously than the extremely tongue-in-cheek and camp 1966 Batman, but they are still big and bonkers and crazy. And it's mostly a change in art style and in a tone of approaching these stories. That changed. That's mostly what they did. However, even as O'Neil and Adams tried to return Batman to his loner roots, he is DC's most popular character, and he could not escape the team-up. Batman remained the headliner in a book called The Brave and the Bold, in which he teamed up with basically everybody. Heroes, villains, it didn't matter. Batman was always the headliner in The Brave and the Bold, and then you had a team-up. This is when Batman starts to get this strange feeling as the mentor of the DC universe. Now, this doesn't come up all the time, but it does come up often enough that you start to wonder where it came from. And the answer is here. Because he was the most popular character that DC owned, he teamed up with everybody. Now, there's an argument that Superman might also have been the most popular character, but a lot of writers feel it's difficult to team people up with Superman because of his power level, especially at the time. That's a conversation for a Superman seminar, but he was very powerful at the time, and it became more difficult to team him up with people, or so the writers of the time thought. Whereas Batman was easy. Batman was able to run with the Justice League despite not having any powers, which means no team up was too powerful for him, but he was also ostensibly just a guy, which meant no team up was too low powered for him. He worked at all levels. And if you look at the history of him since 1939 until the late 70s, you can see that that starts to become the thing that runs through Batman. He's infinitely adaptable, both at a meta level as a character. He adapts to various genres, and in terms of the stories. His superpower becomes adaptability more than anything. Later, this will get reframed as capability, but just know This is where this starts, with The Brave and the Bold. It's also where we got my personal favorite Batman cartoon, Batman the Brave and the Bold, which was built around a very Dick Sprang style of art, and it bills itself very much as a spiritual successor to Batman 66, and it's all about Batman teaming up with various and sundry other heroes. It's great. But as the 1970s draw to a close, we start to open up on the early 80s. I have to talk about the early 80s and the late 80s in terms of DC because a big deal happens right smack dab in the middle in 1985. So, early 80s, or what we will call from here on out, pre-crisis. We introduce a character called Jason Todd. Believe it or not, this is the first new Robin since Dick Grayson had left to become Nightwing. To take a step back, part of making Batman a loner vigilante again was to have a break between Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson. This has been told and retold some different ways. Sometimes it's more acrimonious, sometimes it's less acrimonious. Often it's Bruce realizing that he can't force Dick to live this life anymore. And so he says, you can't be Robin any longer. And Dick chooses to continue to be a crime fighter, albeit with the Teen Titans, and takes on a new costumed identity, Nightwing, and leaves the Robin identity behind. Writers in the early 80s start to realize that the Batman and Robin dynamic is important, and it is important. It's fundamental to the character. You can have Robin go away for a while, but you cannot have Robin go away forever. With that in mind, they introduce Jason Todd. Jason Todd is the first new Robin since Dick Grayson left to become Nightwing and lead the incredibly successful Teen Titans comic book. Just know that there was a time in the late 70s, early 80s, which was the X-Men's first big explosion of popularity with Chris Claremont writing. And during that time, the Teen Titans still tied or outsold the X-Men. It was incredibly popular. And editorial started deciding to groom the next Robin. And there's Jason Todd. Now, this version of Jason Todd is basically a carbon copy of Dick Grayson. They did not want to reinvent the wheel. They just wanted to replace that original relationship. We will talk more about that as we go forward because Morrison puts that into some of his Batman and Robin stories. But just know the pre-crisis approach to Jason Todd is basically Dick Grayson Redux. This is also a time when Batman quit the Justice League because he didn't feel like they were doing the right things all the time, and he starts his own team, the Outsiders. It's also in this early 80s time frame that the increasingly convoluted origin of Batman is condensed and retold for ease in a great book called The Untold Legend of the Batman. I believe originally it was 4 issues. I actually received this as a black and white paperback after mailing in several proofs of purchase from the back of Batman Serial in 1989 and 1990. What this story does is something that TV had actually made famous. You may recall from way back in the 70s and 80s that you would get episodes of a long-running television series that had a present-day story as only a framing device that allowed them to do flashbacks the rest of the episode. This is largely what The Untold Legend of the Batman does. It creates a new present-day story of Batman believing that someone has infiltrated the Batcave, figured out his secret identity, and is waging some sort of war against both Bruce Wayne and Batman. This causes him to go into full-bore detective mode, which means we have to revisit all his old cases, which means we get retold all of this vast nonsense that had accumulated over the last 40 years as people just had to tell more and more different Batman stories, but mind the continuity to do it. So we are reminded that the man who killed Bruce Wayne's parents is named Joe Chill. We are reminded that the housekeeper that took care of Bruce Wayne when he was a young boy is Mrs. Chilton and just happens to be Joe Chill's mother. Only Alfred knows this and must never tell Bruce. We are reminded that as a young boy, Bruce Wayne watched his father, Thomas Wayne, go to a costume party in a bat-themed costume because it's not enough that bats fly through the window and Bruce start declaring that criminals are a superstitious and cowardly lot. We have to tie it to his dad, Thomas. This is where we're reminded that Thomas was kidnapped from that party by a mob boss who had to have a bullet wound treated by the doctor, Dr. Thomas Wayne, kidnapped from this high society ball. When Thomas's actions led to Lou Moxon, the crime boss, being arrested, Moxon declared vengeance on him and hired Joe Chill to go kill him. Joe Chill got cold feet about killing the kid. You see, it's all this giant tangle of continuity that had become a little confusing. Now, many of these stories are decades old. Some of them are only a few years old. It's kind of fascinating that this is the moment that they decided to retell and simplify Batman's origin, because very shortly, 1985 happened and the Crisis on Infinite Earths. I've mentioned Crisis on Infinite Earths in our mini episode about superhero team-ups, because this is a line-wide DC Universe crossover. It took every single hero in every single universe. Just go with me. If you're not familiar with the multiverse, just realize in every superhero universe, there's usually more than one version of the heroes, and that's a multiverse. So Crisis on Infinite Earths takes every version of every character that DC owns, both that they created at day one and that they have accumulated from buying other companies as they go along, and throws them all together in one multiverse-shattering story that leaves everything with a much simpler and simplified continuity. They ostensibly wiped the slate clean so that a new reader could understand DC Comics easily. As you can imagine, this is a mixed bag. It worked pretty well for Superman. It worked decently well for Batman, although not as well as it did for Superman. It worked terribly for Wonder Woman, as she is suddenly not a founding member of the Justice League. Just know, it's a mixed bag, but it's a thing that happened. So just know, after 1986, it's post-Crisis. We get a new, even more streamlined and simplified Batman origin called Batman Year One. It's written by Frank Miller and drawn by David Mazzucchelli. In many ways, both positive and negative, and in my opinion, largely negative as the years rolled on, Batman Year One defines superhero comics, or at least redefines them. It's during this time that Jason Todd stops being a Dick Grayson carbon copy and becomes the child of a criminal that Batman finds on the street, stealing the tires off the Batmobile. Batman chooses to take Jason home off the street, and in the process, inducts him into his war on crime as the next Robin. Now, as far as Batman is concerned, I would say that this time frame just doubles down on the redefinition to grim and gritty. In fact, as much as O'Neill and Adams wanted to be considered grim and gritty, but still were doing these like big James Bond, globe-trotting, sword-fighting, bare-chested love god adventures, this is when we actually get grim and gritty, because Frank Miller takes Batman Year One and turns it into a tale of Bruce Wayne learning what it means to be a vigilante against a city rotten from the core with systemic corruption. Gotham in Year One looks like Beirut, and pre-revitalization New York Times Square had a love child. It is grimy and terrible, and the mayor is corrupt, and the commissioner, who is not Gordon, is corrupt. And Gordon is a new cop moved here from Chicago, and he is honest, but he also has a dark past. It's the real beginning of grim and gritty, and it's done really fantastically well. And I think the ease with which that it did what it did is why people started to believe that they could do grim and gritty just as well. They did not. We also get some really fascinating stories that, again, just double and triple down on the grim and gritty. We get 10 Nights of the Beast, which shows Gotham hosting a visit by then President Ronald Reagan, who is going to be assassinated by a Russian agent called the KG Beast. Over the course of 10 nights, Batman fights the Beast to a standstill and then winds up locking him in the sewers. Batman saying that the KG Beast is too dangerous to let loose, but that Batman doesn't kill. This is philosophically stupid, and you will see it reflected again in the end of Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins. I don't like it at all, but you can see what I mean by the continuing and ongoing darkening of Batman throughout this post-crisis era. You also get a story called A Death in the Family. This story is famous for a variety of reasons. A more and more violent and erratic Jason Todd goes on a solo globetrotting adventure to figure out who his real mother is. And of course, because this is superhero comics, all the options are big and bonkers. There's a parallel story where Batman is not able to deal directly with Jason running all over the world because the Joker has stolen a nuclear missile and is looking for someone to sell it to. And between my extremely capable but a little bit loose cannon protege looking for his lost mother versus madman murder clown with a nuclear missile, Batman, his choice is clear. He's got to go after the Joker. These two stories actually come together in Africa, where Jason finds his real mother, who is a doctor doing relief work in famine-ravaged and war-ravaged Africa. The Joker, who is very low on cash, which is why he's selling the nuclear missile instead of using it, is blackmailing Jason's mother. Jason helps her, and in the process, the Joker beats him nearly to death with a crowbar and then murders both Jason and his mother with a bomb. There is a very famous picture you'll see in the slides of Batman carrying the bleeding, broken body of Robin out of the wreckage. You can imagine, this is kind of the zenith in many ways of the darkest Batman, and it's reflected both internally and externally. At the meta level, that choice to have Jason Todd as Robin die was made by the fans. There were 900 numbers in the penultimate Death in the Family issue that allowed us, the readers, to call in and vote whether Robin would die. And we voted for Robin to die. Now, purportedly, the count was very, very close. But still, that's what we voted for. And I'm going to be honest, I'm one of the fans who voted for Jason Todd to die. I wanted him gone. By this point, he had become angry and violent and insubordinate, and he just no longer worked as Robin in the way that those of us who were still kids and wanted to use Robin as a self-insertion character could deal with. We just didn't want this guy anymore. And so Robin dies viciously on the page, and Batman becomes increasingly vengeful and violent after the death of Jason. This brings us into the 1990s. Now, not unlike Batman's beginnings, where 1939 is the beginning of him, so we have to talk about the 30s a little bit before we go into the 40s, you have a similar situation in 1990, because the 1990s really begin for Batman in 1989 with two things. First and forever in my heart is the new third Robin, Tim Drake. We went for a few years without a Robin, but like I said, editorial had kind of come to realize that Batman without Robin doesn't really work. And so they were already talking about how can we bring in a third Robin that is different than Dick, but not in the ways that made Jason terrible to the fans. So that's the first thing that happens in 1989, and I love it. Tim Drake is almost always and forever my number one Robin, although sometimes there's another one that creeps up to the top of the list. We'll talk more about him as we go. Whoa, look out. The other thing that happens in 1989 that kicks off the 90s for Batman is Tim Burton's Batman movie. It is Batmania all over again. It's toys, it's cereal, it's t-shirts, it's shoes, it's more comics than you know what to do with for the guy who was already buying a ton of comics. Now, over the course of the 90s, we get several more sequels. The first one, Batman Returns, is done in the same Tim Burton style and is not nearly as successful as the first movie. Also, Tim Burton is apparently somewhat difficult to work with as far as Warner Brothers is concerned, and they hand the reins off to Joel Schumacher. And Joel Schumacher starts to create movies that are much more overtly camp. You might say that they are the first serious update of Batman 66. I don't mean serious as in tone, clearly. I mean a serious attempt to take what worked in Batman 66 and to repackage it for a then modern audience. But another piece of mass media that was very firmly in the 90s and that would go on to influence Batman to the present is Batman the Animated Series. Now, I have an entire podcast where we are talking about Batman the Animated Series. It's called An Animated Discussion. And if you are not familiar with Batman the Animated Series, it is streaming on Amazon Prime. You should watch it because it is fantastic. It is so stylish. It is so well written. It is so amazingly Batman and yet weird at the same time that I couldn't help but start a podcast about it where we discuss the best of the best episodes. So take a watch of Batman the Animated Series, definitely. And if it intrigues you like I think it will, please take a listen to An Animated Discussion where a film critic friend of mine, Caleb Masters, helps me unpack what made this show amazing. Incidentally, it also gave birth to an entire DC animated universe. It ran for a few years, and then there was a Superman animated series, and Batman and Superman ran for a couple more years, and then they went away in favor of a Justice League, which ran for a couple of years, and then it gave birth to Justice League Unlimited. And it's the success of this unexpected animated universe that has led us to a place where we are still getting an endless line of animated films from DC that are, frankly, significantly higher quality than most of their live action movies are. I digress. To return to the 90s. We also have a story called Nightfall. Nightfall is fascinating. It came at a time when Superman had recently been killed. It's also at a time when Batman had kind of done this grim and gritty business as hard as he possibly could. And the man who started that business, Denny O'Neil, was now in charge of the entire line of Batman comics. And he was tired of hearing fans say that Batman needed to become Dirty Harry, that Batman needed to become the kind of guy who murders criminals. And so, Denny O'Neil concocted the Nightfall experiment. They introduced a new character called Bane, who would show up and be in every way the equal and in some ways the better of Batman. And at the end of the beginning of Nightfall, Bane breaks Bruce Wayne's back. Bruce Wayne now becomes a footnote in the story of Batman as he goes off and has adventures that eventually lead to him regaining the use of his legs and returning to the mantle of the Bat. But in the meantime, he hands it off to a character that Denny O'Neil had also created called Azrael. Azrael is probably the most 90s thing ever to show up in Batman comics, and that is saying something. 90s superhero comics are well known for suddenly introducing many pouch-wearing, giant gun-toting, somewhat mindless killers as superheroes. Marvel did this a lot. DC did it a little, but the most famous example of this is definitely Azrael. Programmed to be a fighter against evil and an assassin in a vaguely angel-themed costume, Jean-Paul Valley would wear the mantle of Azrael, the avenging angel. He is a very violent addition to the Bat family, and he's really more Bat family adjacent. And if you're reading the story, why Bruce Wayne would ask Azrael to come in and step in as Batman rather than Dick Grayson is a little bit confusing even at the time. At the moment in continuity, they were having Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson very much at odds and not speaking and estranged. But still, you invite this murderer that you are trying to help get over being a murderer and trying to show him a better way to fight crime, but you haven't succeeded yet. And you invite that guy to wear your outfit instead of your son. So just accept that it doesn't make all the in-fiction sense that we would like it to make. But again, that's because O'Neil was proving a point. He turned Batman into the thing that fans thought they wanted. A murderer, a killer, a person of single-minded vengeance. And if you listen to him talk about it today, O'Neil was terrified that he would discover that they were right in what they wanted. But over the course of the story, fans realized that's not what they wanted from Batman. They needed Bruce Wayne back. And so Batman eventually is reinstated as Bruce Wayne and the Azrael chapter is closed. But this leads us into the 2000s, which, you'll sense a theme, kind of really begins in 1999. It begins in 1999 with a story called No Man's Land. So the 2000s would be typified by really excellent, serious crime authors coming into the comic books and starting to write very crime-oriented, street-level, grounded versions of Batman. It's worth noting that this is also around the time that Batman is messing around in the future and fighting angels and also evil Martians and a whole bunch of other stuff in Justice League. But in his own series of titles, they're very grounded, they're very street level, they're very, for lack of a better term, real. And this starts with No Man's Land. No Man's Land begins with a story called Cataclysm, where a supervillain holds Gotham hostage against earthquakes. And when Batman's unable to stop him, he sets off the earthquake machine and it basically knocks Gotham flat. Now, this is after there had been a story about a plague being released in Gotham and all kinds of other things that make Gotham City a hellscape. And so, under the pushing of Lex Luthor, the United States government declares Gotham no man's land and cuts it off from the United States. There's a deadline for everyone who wants to get out, but a few people stay because Gotham is their home. Commissioner Gordon is one of these. Sergeant Bullock, who became famous from Batman the Animated Series, is one of these, as is Lieutenant Montoya, who also became famous from Batman the Animated Series. These characters, they stay. Noticeably absent at first is Bruce Wayne. He went to Washington as Bruce Wayne to argue against losing Gotham and failed, and it gave him a bit of a crisis of faith. He returns to an essentially post-apocalyptic Gotham City as Batman and begins to attempt to protect his city in the new and very different and vicious way that it needs protecting now. Now, I say vicious because the city had fallen to essentially tribal ruin, and what was left of the police, who have now no authority or power, are trying to keep a lid on it. And they're just not doing as well as they'd like. Bruce Wayne comes into that. As Batman, he is estranged from the police because Gordon knows that he wasn't the guy wearing the outfit as Azrael. He doesn't know what went on there behind the mask, but he knows that wasn't his friend, that his friend abandoned the city once and then abandoned it again during the beginning of No Man's Land. And then after a year of stories running through all 6 of Batman's titles, you came to a conclusion where Gotham is rebuilt and reinstated. But this moves into yet another series of personal shakeups. One of Bruce Wayne's longtime love interests from the 70s is murdered in Wayne Manor, and suddenly Bruce Wayne is accused of the killing. And for a long time, the titles were all centered on a story called Bruce Wayne Murderer. And when he'd had enough of being kept in prison, he escaped because he's extremely capable. And then we had a long-running story of Bruce Wayne Fugitive. This is also when we have the story Hush introduced. Hush is very famous. It was drawn by Jim Lee. It's very beautiful, but I would like you to consider Hush as a Batman cover/tribute album. It is a book that is built around big, giant images of Batman doing amazing stuff that only Batman can do. You can tell that it's amazing stuff only Batman can do because every single one of them happened in another book better. And the reason I say better is because these individual moments were given context and clarity in their individual stories. And bringing them all together in one book drawn by an amazing artist does make for very exciting reading, but it doesn't make for very deep storytelling. You also get Under the Hood, which reintroduces Jason Todd as a villainous vigilante who is prepared to murder and take over crime families to protect Gotham City. You also have Stephanie Brown, who had been a love interest of the second Robin and a vigilante in her own right as the spoiler. She becomes the 4th Robin, and she accidentally sets into motion a plan created by Bruce Wayne to bring all of Gotham City's crime under the control of the Batman. There is a piece that she does not know about because this was Bruce Wayne's plan, and it erupts into a giant gang war that results in Stephanie dead. It is character assassination both internally and externally. Stephanie deserved better. She was a great Robin, and she will be back and will be better in many ways, I can say. Eventually we get a happy ending-ish for Stephanie. This moves us into 2006. There is much more to be said about Batman and what happens to him in the time after Grant Morrison wrote him. And I may return to those stories later, but this is where I will end my history. Because 2006 is when Grant Morrison takes over the Batman books and begins what I describe as his opus. Now, while technically this is not Batman focused, I am going to use this moment to kind of transition into talking about Grant's approach to superheroes, because it impacts his approach to Batman very heavily. And again, while I love talking about the history of Batman, and there is tons more that I could go into here, the point of this background is so you're ready to read Morrison's long-running opus. So, Grant's approach to superhero universes. So a lot of this is going to sound very strange because Morrison's approach to the real world could be considered very strange by many. So this is how he approaches superhero universes. He believes that these imagination spaces have taken on a life of their own and are, in some sense, just as real as our own reality. They may be a lower dimension, but they are not a less real dimension. You can see this play out in books like The Invisibles, where he self-inserts a character that is basically the idealized version of himself. This character is called King Mob. And if you listen to Morrison talk about his life at the time, as long as he was writing good things happening to King Mob, good things happened to Grant Morrison. But at a certain point, because it is every writer's job to make his characters' lives miserable, Morrison starts to put the clamps and screws on King Mob. And as bad things happened to King Mob in the story, bad things started happening to Morrison, including almost dying from some sort of bacterial infection. This is, I think, the beginning of Morrison's belief in the interconnectedness of imagination spaces to real space. You see this played out more in Animal Man. He started to write a lower tier character of DC's called Animal Man. And in the process of Animal Man's stories, Animal Man eventually comes out of his own story and meets Grant Morrison. Now, this is Grant Morrison writing Grant Morrison. It is still a self-insertion character, but he is self-inserting his actual self instead of an idealized version of himself. And Animal Man is demanding to know why this person, who has so much control over the hero's life, would make his life so miserable. Fascinating stuff. This probably culminates in a story called Final Crisis, which I am not going to talk a lot about now because we may need to dig really deep into that as we go through the Batman stuff. It does tie into his larger Batman story in important ways, but it's also so big that I can't really get into it. But just know that it takes these ideas that he's been working on for 20, 30 years of his life as a writer and really coalesces them around these bigger-than-life superhero characters. So that's Morrison's approach to superheroes. What does this mean for Batman? There are no continuity breaks. Every Batman story that has ever been published has happened in the past of this Batman starring in Batman and Son. They may not have all happened exactly as written. Sometimes they become hallucinations or experiments or drug-induced weirdness, but they are all equally valid interpretations of the character. And after the massive backlash from Batman 66 and how most, air quotes, serious Bat fans don't want to deal with that science fiction era in the 50s before that, this is an absolutely revolutionary take. The way that Morrison makes this work in terms of this version of Bruce Wayne is that broadly the above eras slot into various 1 to 3 year slices of Bruce Wayne's personal 10-year history. There is a thing within the DC universe that it is perpetually 10 years after Batman and Superman debuted. So Batman and Superman show up. Maybe there were superheroes in the 40s or 50s, but the modern DC universe starts when Batman and Superman come out on the scene, and it is always perpetually, always, no matter how much water goes under the bridge, 10 years later. Morrison prioritizes these various decades of time that I've covered into 1 to 3 year slices of that 10 years. This is also Batman at his absolute best. This is Batman, the peak human being of an entire superhero universe, at the peak of what it means to be Batman. There is no version of Bruce Wayne as Batman that is more Batman than this Batman. We also have some recurring themes. I already mentioned a lot of hallucinogenic drugs and experiments. There are a lot of altered mind states throughout this story. And these are not themes that Morrison pulled out of nowhere. These are themes that have been existing in Batman comics for decades. You've got Joker gas. You've got Venom, the drug that Bane takes to make himself super strong. You have Scarecrow's fear gas and a variety of other villain-inflicted bouts with hallucinogens. It keeps coming up for Batman, and Morrison just goes ahead and makes that part of the narrative instead of just the meta-narrative. Morrison also puts nature versus nurture right there on the superhero page. Here at the beginning in Batman and Son, you will see this most especially in terms of Tim Drake, our second Robin, and Damian Wayne, who we will be introduced to as Bruce Wayne's son. But it also becomes a question that clouds around Bruce's own formative years, both as a child who decides to be Batman and also the earliest years of his career as Batman. Did Bruce Wayne create Batman, or did the world turn Bruce Wayne into Batman? Did Bruce Wayne's war on crime turn him into the Batman that he is today? Or did the evolution of that war on crime turn him into the Batman he is today? And does it matter? Or is it just a thing you have to recognize and move forward? Nature versus nurture continually comes up as a theme through this story. You also have a color juxtaposition, red and black. Now, there are a million things this can mean. I'm not even sure that I have got them all figured out. I'm not even sure Morrison figured them all out, but just know that these colors factor heavily into his Batman stories, and you are going to see them all the time. So just keep your eyes open for them, and we'll talk about them as we go. And I hope you guys have as much fun with that as I do, because I think you're going to tell me things I missed. Lastly, a very important recurring theme for this first part of the Batman opus is Zur-En-Arrh. I mentioned it earlier as a weird sci-fi story from the 50s where Batman is kidnapped by an alien Batman to a planet where Bruce Wayne gains the powers of Superman. Batman becomes the Superman of Planet X. Planet X is Zur-En-Arrh. There is a Batman there. Just know that that is a story that's out there and that it will heavily influence the earliest parts of Grant Morrison's Batman work. So, that brings us up to the present-ish. Obviously, there have been many more Batman stories published after Grant Morrison left, but that is where I'm going to leave this history of Batman. Both because it's difficult to have any kind of historical context on things that only happened 5 or 10 years ago, but also because those stories don't impact his work, which is the thing that I am going to go into with Batman and Son. For your homework, pick up a copy of Batman and Son by Grant Morrison, with art by Andy Kubert, J.H. Williams III, and Tony S. Daniel. There will be a link in the show notes so you can make sure you get the right one, because there have been a couple of different versions. Read only Batman and Son, or read only the first issue if you want to kind of leave it a surprise to yourself. And I'll try not to spoil things, but honestly, I make no promises. Everything folds in on itself in this story, and eventually we're just going to have to talk about it in the larger context. But I will do my best not to spoil things as we go issue by issue. So thank you very much for attending this session of Superhero University. Buckle up for some new Batman fun as we go forward. If you want to continue the conversation from this session, I am most active on Twitter, and you can find me easily at Joshua Unruh. And remember that Superhero University is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/pulpdictionproductions. And if you can't support us financially, please tell your friends to give any of our shows a listen, or write a glowing review at iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play. Great reviews are really the best way for new people to discover the show and join the conversation with all of us. So again, thank you for joining me for this episode of Superhero University, and until next time, we'll see you back here. Same bat time, same bat channel.